Hi, I'm JoAnn Zeise. I'm the Curator of Cultural History here at the South Carolina State Museum, and I'm going to welcome you into our new quilt exhibit called Bindings in Between. So come on in the gallery and see all the beautiful things we have. So we have this beautiful section here with some of our highlights from the show. And over here, we have a section of the exhibit that's all about the power of place in our lives. So the women who made these quilts all came from a certain part of the state that we're going to call, it's above the fall line. So the fall line is where, right here in Columbia is a great example where the rocks are, and it's really hard to navigate up and down stream. So trade, especially before cars and trains, becomes very limited. So the women who made these quilts had not as many fabric options as, say, some of the women might have in Charleston or some other cities. But also it was settled with a lot of folks who came down the Great Wagon Road. So there's a lot of people who were of Scotch-Irish descent and German. And when we look at some of the details on these, and if you want to maybe Google some German designs from the 1800s, you see a lot of similarities in the kinds of colors and the kinds of motifs that you have in these quilts, as well as a lot of the color choices, as well as like things like, to maybe our modern eye, say this border doesn't seem to quote unquote match the rest of the quilt. That's our big common thing from this backcountry area, the Carolinas, where we'll see that. Also this use of colors, what we call a cheddar yellow, just like what it sounds like, ox blood, red and brown, which has no oxes were involved. That's just what they called it. There's no actual blood in this color. And the use of the greens and the reds. And so you see a lot of that throughout these quilts. But while you see it, you also see the variation. Like these two quilts are technically kind of the same pattern, but it's a play on those. So even though they have this repetition, there's still so much creativity and individuality in these quilts. So a lot about place in that one. Now over here, we really kind of let go of the rigidness of the pattern. And it's not to say these don't have patterns, but they kind of let that go into some more free-form design. So this beautiful quilt here from Hilton Head area, and these wonderful crazy quilts filled with so many great details and needlework. Now, when we say quilts, kind of what do we mean when we say quilts? Because are these quilts? Well, they weren't meant to be cuddled up. They're about throw size. So they weren't really meant to go on your bed. They were meant to be put over your couch so you could display it. But we're still going to use them as quilts because they've got, some of them have 3 layers. Most of them only have 1 or 2. There's the top. Like this one over here is just a top, which gives us a great way to talk about how quilts are made. So when we say quilts, we mean 3 layers generally. So we mean a top layer, like this is just a top, and you can see it's unfinished down here. So she did the top of this, and then you have a backing fabric, which this is an example of some flour sacks used as a backing fabric. And then you have your top layer that you might have pieced together, and then you quilt all of those with a batting in the middle. So you have a top, a middle, and a back. This section of the exhibit is some of the earliest quilts in the whole collection of quilts. And I should point out really quick that all of the quilts you're seeing today are from our collection. So these are all here at the State Museum. But these are much older quilts, and they do look very different when you start looking at them. So instead of this many different types of fabric, these are called whole cloth or white on white type quilts. And you can see here all of this beautiful white work, and each one of these is a different way. Some of this is cording, some of this is stuffing, where you actually fill the fabric in from behind. And this is very delicate, hard to execute needlework. You would very often sign, like she did up here with the date 1926, Teresa did, to show off this wonderful creation of skill and beauty. Some of our most famous quilts are in here too. So this quilt was made by Sarah Ward. You can see a little SW there, and there's another one down there. But it was supposedly made also with her beau, who happened to be President Andrew Johnson, who you might remember was president right after Abraham Lincoln's assassination. He was from North Carolina. He came down to South Carolina. He was kind of run away from his apprenticeship as a tailor. And it was very common for tailors actually to help women who were quilting. Tailors would often help them mark out these designs, so it totally makes sense. You know, so it's all kind of written down. So it's very likely that President Andrew Johnson did in fact help her with that quilt. So this is another one, because this quilt right here, another beautiful white work piece, a little bit finer done than that one there when you really get down to the detail, was made by Carolina Matilda Golding and her unnamed enslaved needle workers at her plantation in Lawrence County. And this quilt was made especially for display at the 1851 World's Fair in London. That's the one that Queen Victoria and Prince Albert put on. And the story was that Queen Victoria loved it so much she wanted one, but we asked, and there are no records of that, but there are records of her making this quilt. And when we talk about who made the quilt, this is a great example of this. We put her name on it and the unnamed enslaved needleworkers, because we do have from her family that they did help her make it. But when we see any of these quilts, especially from this time period, we have to recognize it's not just usually one woman making these quilts. Sometimes it's enslaved needleworkers, sometimes it's community members that come together. And when we think about these quilts and the way they've changed, is we go from this white work to where all this fabric starts coming, and fabric becomes cheaper, and it's printed in all these different ways like chintz. So this is like a whole wall of like these chintz applique fabrics. This is a beautiful tree of life quilt. And what you would do is you would buy a big bolt of fabric, of chintz fabric, like you see on this quilt with the wreaths. And you were supposed to cut a piece of it out. They didn't on that one, but here they did. You can see how they chose the fabric to build their design. It's kind of like building a flower display, and you're picking and choosing which things to put in your vase. So you're picking and choosing which fabrics to use to create the design that you want. Now this one's from 1820, so you look at that stitching, that's well before we have our sewing machines, which don't appear until like the 1850s or so. And you can see more of this beautiful fabric here, this chintz fabric. And chintz, it has a sheen to it. So sometimes it's gone, and here you might be able to see a little bit with the camera. So that's done by heating the fabric and pressing it. It's called calendaring it. And you can see all the different fabrics. When you start staring at these and you see the work, so they had to cut this out. So if you think about cutting this very expensive fabric ever so carefully, and then very carefully in very tiny stitches to apply it or applique to that original quilt. Now this quilt right here definitely has many makers, and we have a lot of different signatures on the quilt. You can see some initials there and some there. And so what would happen is very often women would get together to make album quilts, and they would each do a square and then bring it at a certain date, and then everybody would get together and quilt it all together. Sometimes there would be themes, sometimes women would just do whatever they felt, sometimes they'd share fabric. But very often these were done to commemorate something, maybe a woman leaving or getting married, but very often they were just done for a heck of a lot of fun. Now this section of the exhibit is probably the more modern area. As fabrics get cheaper and more variety, women start using them in different ways in quilts, and you may be catching on to see how that happens here. These are some beautiful center medallion quilts. This is a beautiful quilt, and it was made for Lucy Tucker Catlett Vance, and it was made for her wedding. And there's a signature somewhere. Oh, here it is. It says MACV from your mother, right there in the corner, Mary Alice Catlett Vance. Now this one is amazing, and I hope you can see like little me next to it. Not that I'm little, but it's huge. I'd also remind you that beds were not standard size in the early 1800s. This was made in the 1840s, and the quilt was also supposed to come all the way down the side of the bed. So it's not that they had huge beds. It's just it was meant to go all the way down to the floor to keep the breeze from coming under the bed. So this one is a hexagon quilt, and this one is made in 1840s. This was a really popular style, especially in Charleston. Even after this style went away, it stayed popular in Charleston for decades later. This version is 1870s actually. But when you get in, you see each one of these little hexagons. So a woman would cut out a paper template, whip stitch the fabric around it, and then join them together. And I love this little seashell fabric here. So you can imagine the amount of time and energy it went to get into this and make something like this. It would take a really long time, and to think about all the different colors and designs in it. Now this is the back of a very similar quilt, and why we did this is so you can see the paper that this person has actually left on the back of the quilt. So because these were so labor intensive, many women didn't finish them. So a lot of times you'll see these with the paper still attached because they never quite got around to finishing the thing, and I cannot say I blame them. This is a fun quilt because it's by the amazing Carrie Coachman out in Georgetown, who is Folklife Heritage, a winner. And one of the things I like to talk about in this quilt is that there's this old myth that quilters put a mistake on purpose in their quilts. And if anyone is quilted, they will tell you, you do not have to put one in on purpose. So that happens very often. So this quilt has a quote unquote mistake in it. Now I don't know if Miss Coachman was doing this on purpose or not, but I'm not going to tell you where it is, but one of the sailboats is missing a wee piece. So I always let people find it on their own. But that's one of the many myths that have come down, like women only made quilts for weddings, or they put a mistake in them and that kind of thing. So a beautiful quilt. But I'm going to end, because I've talked and talked, I'm going to end on one of my favorite quilts. And this is a beautiful, beautiful quilt made in 1840s by Rachel Lucindo McCrighton. This was in Fairfield County. And you can see the amazing quilting done on here. And when you really look at the delicate stitching that she's done, this is well before the sewing machine came in. So she has the beautiful chintz fabric, and then she's done this white on white work with the stuffing in here that she's done. And you can also see in here, if you might see this mesh, and you may notice it when you come in the exhibit, you'll see this mesh fabric in places. That's conservation work done to help our quilts and make sure we keep them safe. So that is why that is here. But if this is one of my favorites, just because it has all of the things on it. It's got the stuffed work, the chintz, the beautiful quilting. So it's an absolute masterpiece, and it's really one you need to come see in person. So I cannot stress this enough. As wonderful as the images are, it's really important to come see all these beautiful things in person. Thanks for joining us on this virtual tour of Bindings in Between, the quilt exhibition at the South Carolina State Museum, which will be up until the spring, so check our website and make sure before you head on in. But we want to thank you again for being here. I have been JoAnn Zeise, the Curator of Cultural History here at the State Museum. Thanks.